Session looking at device drivers. There's not a huge amount to know about device drivers, and a lot of it you already know already. So I'm simply going to say how device drivers work. We've already looked at what interrupts are and the idea of an interrupt handler, or specifically interrupt service routines. What we're going to be looking at now is how they link to device drivers. So, in order for a user process to access devices such as the hard drive or anything like that, it has to go via the kernel, it has to go via the operating system. Okay, so if it wants to save a file, it needs to ask the operating system to save the file, then the operating system needs to go ahead and save it. Now, because different devices work differently, even for the same type. So, for example, if I have hard drives made by two different manufacturers, they might work ever so slightly differently. The operating system doesn't really want to have to worry about that problem. So what it does is it uses a device driver which will translate what it wants to do into something the device will understand. So the process itself doesn't really care about how the files can be saved, the type of the hardware, or anything like that. It only cares about the operation it wants to perform, i.e. saving. So we end up with a situation where the user wants to save, it then has to, the operating system has to talk to the device driver, which in turn. So the kernel has generic ways of communicating with devices, okay? So it just has like a save function. The device driver will then kind of translate that generic request to save into something that the hard drive is going to understand. And because we have lots of different devices, we can have lots of different devices. So each device will have its own device driver. This is one of the reasons that when you first buy a device, let's say a graphics card, and you plug it into your computer, you have to then install device drivers in order to get the best out of it. So as an example, let's say I've written some Python code like this. So it opens a file up, writes to the file, and then closes it. Okay, so this code will first of all run some code via the operating system. It will ask the operating system to save the file. The operating system will then will save the data into a new file by talking to the device driver to say, okay, here's the data you can save into this file. The device driver will then handle the rest of it. Okay, so the operating system takes the generic idea, tells the device driver, which then takes that generic idea and turns it into something specific. So this diagram kind of explains the process we're going through. So we've got the operating system here. It's terribly written, but there you go. You can just about tell what it is. Each device will have a different device driver, but each device must have a device driver. That driver is responsible for converting the abstracted call from the operating system into something more specific that the device is going to understand. Let's just finish off by looking at the relationship between interrupt service routines and device drivers. Now, device drivers contain code for the interrupt service routines. They're not just the code for interrupt service routines, but they must contain that code to manage it. So when, for example, the hard drive sends an interrupt back to the CPU, because that device can be treated in a specific way, it will have its own interrupt service routine which will run and then form the operating system. So on the right we've got a screenshot of devices. So this is device manager, and actually I've kind of highlighted a keyboard device. So the keyboard device will have a device driver which okay, so here is a screenshot of that device driver. You see here, these are the files that it's using. This is the details of it right here. Okay, so it's actually written by Microsoft in this case. So this is the device driver being used to manage the keyboard that I was using to create this presentation. Now, if you recall back to when we talk about interrupt service requests, these are numbers which correspond to the flags in the register. Each one of these is assigned to a different device, and this is an example of some of those links. So you can see here I've got the interrupt request number, and then next to it I've got what it links to. Okay, so looking at a more obvious example, we've got interrupt request 22 is linked to the audio controller, i.e. sound card. Now this does not mean that devices are just interrupt service routines, but they do contain the code to actually manage it. So subject clarification, candidates need to understand what's meant by device drivers and why they need for communication between hardware and the operating system.